we're going to look at some expressions. Your goal for today is I can write expressions numerically and verbally. So with expressions, this is the first time where we're going to add letters into math. We're used to just using numbers, and so don't get scared. It's not hard, but this lesson is mostly talking about some vocabulary that we're going to use going forward. All right, so our first thing is we're going to look at numerical expressions and algebraic expressions. So with numerical expressions, if you just look at the word numerical, it looks like the word number, which is exactly what a numerical expression is. It contains only numbers. So here we have 3 plus 4. That's something that you've seen a lot. We have 2 parentheses, 7 plus 3 close parentheses. We just kind of worked with that with distributive property. And then here we have 18 divided by 6. You've worked with numerical expressions for most of your academic career. But now we're going to move into algebraic expressions. So an algebraic expression is the same thing as a numerical expression, except it contains something called a variable. And a variable we're going to talk about later, but it's a fancy name for letter. Okay? So if you look down here, instead of 2 plus 3, you have 2x plus 3. Over here, instead of just a distributive property with numbers, you have 3 parentheses 4x minus 5 close parentheses. And then here you have 1 over 3x. Now, the most widely used variable is x. We tend to use the letter x a lot. And this x looks a lot like a multiplication sign, but it's also a variable. That becomes difficult when we're looking at a problem or an expression like this. Does that mean 2 times positive 3 or 2x plus 3? To help with this confusion, we're going to start using this little dot to mean multiplication. We've used it a little bit over the course of the year, but we're going to start to use it a lot more, and it's an important habit to begin so that your x's are not getting mixed up between multiplication signs and variables. All right, so we're going to look at some basic vocabulary and we're going to practice. So our first vocabulary word is constant. If you think of the word constant in everyday life, something that's constant is something that's always there. It doesn't change, it doesn't go away, and that's exactly what it is in a mathematical sentence. This 4 right here is by itself. It's on its own. It does not change, and so it's a constant. There's no letter or variable attached to it. It is just by itself. The next vocab word that we have is variable, and we just kind of talked about that briefly when we talked about algebraic expressions, but a variable is a symbol used to represent a number, and the symbol that we most often use is a letter. We use X, we use Y, we use P, W, any letter of the alphabet. Variables will always have a number with them, which we'll talk about in a second. Sometimes you can see the number and sometimes you can't, and we'll talk about that as well. The next 2 words that we have are coefficient and term. So a coefficient is a value being multiplied to a variable. So we just talked about variables in the last slide. Now let's talk about the number in front of the variable. That's the coefficient. A coefficient is a number that's in front of a letter. It always has to be attached to a letter. If it does not, then it would look like this 4, which is by itself, which is a constant. So again, a coefficient is always the number in front of the letter. Last but not least, we have term. So term is an element or number in an expression. And I kind of like to think about it as pieces of a puzzle that put together the whole expression. So over here in 2x plus 4, this 2x is one whole unit. This 4 is another unit, and these units are called terms. So this 2x is a term, and this 4 is a term. And if we had more numbers added onto here, or subtracted or multiplied or divided, those would be terms as well. All right, so let's go ahead and practice some of these. So we have example number 1 over here. We have 5m plus 2 plus 6. So we're going to first look for our constants, then our variables, then our coefficients, and then our terms. So remember that a constant is a number that is by itself. So here we have a 2 and we have a 6. There's no letter attached to them. They are by themselves. They're not going to change. So I'm going to list those out here, 2 and 6. Now we're going to look for our variable. Remember, our variable is a letter, and here's our variable. And in this case, our variable is m. Next, we're going to look for our coefficient. So our coefficient, that's the number in front of the variable, and we have that right here. And in front of the m, that is the number 5. And last but not least, we're going to look for terms. So remember, terms are the different pieces of the puzzle that make up the expression. So the first term that we have is 5m. The second term that we have is 2. And the last term that we have is 6. All right, let's look at another example. So we have 3 plus y plus 14 plus 2y. Again, we're going to start with our constants. So where are the numbers that are by themselves with no variable? Well, we have 3 and we have 14. So I'm going to list those right here. Okay, now we're going to look for the variable. All right, so it appears twice in this expression, but it's the same variable. You can have more than one type of variable in your expression, but in this case we just have one, and it's y. Next, we're going to look for the coefficient. So remember, the coefficient is the number that is in front of the variable. So right here, I have the number 2. But there is actually a coefficient right here in front of this y. And the coefficient in front of it is 1. And I'm going to make that a little bit darker so that you can see it. But it is the number 1. Now, we don't write the number 1 in front of a variable typically because we assume that it's there. It's like when you have the fraction 3 over 1, we know that that's 3. We don't need to write a 1 under it. You can also think of it in terms of decimals. If you have 5.0, you can just write 5. You don't have to write 5.0. You assume that the 0.0 is there somewhere. So we don't typically write the 1 in front of the y. We know that it is just y. But when we're listing out the coefficients, it's important that we recognize there is a 1 in front of that. And last but not least, we have to do our terms. So our first term is right here, and that is 3. Our second term right here is y. Our third term is 14. And our last term is 2y. All right, so let's try some more examples here. Okay, so we have 36x plus 5x plus 7. So let's look at our constants first. Remember, our constants are the numbers by themselves. So we just have one constant, which is 7. We're going to look for our variable, and in this case, we have the same variable, and it appears twice, and that is x. Now we're going to look for our coefficient. Our coefficient is the number in front of the variable. So in this case, we have 2 of them. So we have 36 and we have 5. And last but not least, we need to list out the terms. So our first term is 36x. The second term is 5x. And the third term is 7. All right, let's look at another example. So we have 23 plus 9 plus 9p minus p. So let's start with our constants first. So we have 23 and we have 9. And again, the constant is just a number that appears by itself. No variable attached. All right, now where are our variables? So we have the same variable that appears twice, which is p. Now we're going to look for our coefficient. So our coefficient is the number in front of the variable. So we have 9. And if you remember from just 2 examples ago, there's an invisible coefficient right in front of here, and that is 1. Now, this one is slightly different than the last example, and here's why. Do you see this minus sign right here? This minus sign acts as a negative. So this coefficient is actually -1. And that will become important when we start to do things called combining like terms. But it's very important that you know that if there's a minus sign in front of it, it's going to be -1. So now let's list out our terms. So the first one that we have is 23. The second one that we have is 9. The third term is 9p. And the last term is going to be negative p. Or, if it makes you more comfortable, you can write negative 1p. All right. We have two more examples. So we look at the first one, 9x plus 6x minus 2. I'm going to go a little bit quicker on this one. So first we have our constant, that's our number by itself. I know a lot of you caught that minus sign in front of it. So your constant is going to be negative 2. Your variable appears twice, but it's the same one, so it's x. Your coefficient is the number in front of the variable, so you have a 9 and you have a 6. And last but not least, we're going to list out our terms. The first one is 9x, the second one is 6x, and the third one is, you guessed it, negative 2. All right, for our last example, we have 12 plus 4m minus 2m plus 3. All right, so what are our constants? Our numbers by themselves. So we have 12, and I know you caught that, negative 3. Then we have our variables. So it looks like in this example we have m. And now we're going to look for our coefficients. So we have 4, and in this case we have negative 2. So let's list out all of our terms one last time. So we have 12, we have 4m, we have negative 2m, and we have negative 3. Now sometimes people will say, well, if we write the negative in front of the 2, why don't we write a plus sign in front of the 4? We don't do it because if there's nothing in front of a number, we always just assume that it's positive, that it is plus. So to do a little bit less writing, have a little bit less confusion, we just write when there is a negative sign. All right, that is the end of this lesson. Remember that you can go back, you can fast forward, you can rewind, you can pause, and you can always ask me questions in class.